so good to see you, and it is wonderful to be seen. I just want everybody watching us to know right now, EunSook is the truth. And if you don't know, now you know. So let's get into it. Um, so look, I made a comment just now about how historically we don't really talk about the role of AAPI participation in politics, in civic engagement, and in power building. And historically, civic participation amongst this range of communities has been disproportionately low. However, AAPI communities are becoming a growing swing vote and political force in key regions across the country. Talk to us a little bit about how you've been able to help foster a culture of civic engagement within the AAPI communities and bridge historically low voter registration and turnout rates. How do you move people from being like, I'm not sure that's for me, to becoming more informed, more activated, more engaged, and more powerful?
Sure. I mean, I think the primary reason why APIs have not been as engaged historically is because they've been historically underfunded. APIP, Asian Americans in Philanthropy, did a study that said in the past 25 years, APIs receive less than 1% of philanthropic dollars, which means there's no investment in the community to enable them to do the work. So initiatives like our fund, one of our primary goals is to first and foremost is to fund groups on the ground. That's the bulk of our resources go to support local groups. Right now we're funding 22 groups in 16 states. And it's not only funding them, the recognition is that because they had been historically underfunded, oftentimes they're also excluded from these tables, the civic engagement tables. So what is it about making sure that they're a part and included? The other thing is that a lot of the tools and resources civic engagement create often is not adaptable for API communities. One of the first things is, for example, they do not allow for Asian languages. So if you're trying to text or send out information and it doesn't allow for Asian text to be integrated, it's not usable. A lot of the voter data didn't allow for disaggregated data. So you couldn't pull out at one time, I think it was like in 2012, you couldn't pull out Vietnamese voters in Philadelphia. So how are you going to be reaching out to your community when that data doesn't exist? So our work is one, supporting groups on the ground. Two is looking at the tools that exist and looking to not only give access to those tools to our groups, but doing what we can to improve them. The other part is that I think, and this is something that took time, is it feels like in the beginning you think, well, maybe the mainstream civic engagement groups know more than us. So we were looking to see what they knew and share that knowledge with our community. But truthfully, if we're really looking at doing this in a racial equity and intersectional lens, it's really saying, well, what does our community already know? How do we make sure that the tactics and strategies that are utilized are actually culturally affirming? How do we integrate the two? Because truthfully, our community knows best what works. They know what messages work in our community. They're listening to the community. They're not talking at them. And so that was something that we've been really pushing forward. And that's what we mean by a culture of civic engagement, is how do we ensure that our community is able to lead the effort? And I think we've seen incremental success. It's really important to know that from 2016 to in terms of the turnout rate for APIs, 2018, for example, was a breakout year, unprecedented turnout, and more so for API women than API men. It tells you a little bit around, again, why we need to look at this intersectionally, because truthfully, it's not just about increasing turnout, it's the fact that API women have also emerged as leaders in our community.
This is important. I feel like whenever we talk about political engagement, we do it with these broad swaths. And I just really appreciate what you just said, which is that, our civic engagement strategies also have to reflect like the structures of our communities and really invest in, right, the leaders in our communities to help increase participation, which will increase political power for all of us. Tell me a little bit about what it means to be engaging people civically during a global pandemic. I mean, obviously, when we have election cycles and in between, if you're doing best practice, we're out there, we're knocking doors, right? We're talking to people in grocery stores, we're talking to people where they are, but we're in a situation where we can't really do that safely. So talk with me a little bit about how you're adapting to this moment, making sure that our communities stay powerful in politics while also making sure our communities stay safe.
So part of it is just, if we're talking technical, one is that many of our groups said, they need more resources just to pivot. Obviously, many of them may not have had the digital infrastructure that they need, recognizing that, it used to be the phone banking, no one picked up the phone, but now everyone's picking up the phone. So actually that's an opportunity. Yep. So you can't do door canvassing anymore. It's harder to have gatherings, festivals. A lot of the in-person contact, as we all know, is not possible, whether it's in the church or what have you, in the supermarkets. So there was a lot of requests to increase capacity, to purchase tools, to train staff, because there's also a lot of staff training we have to do, to hire more both bilingual and biliterate staff. There's a lot of production we're going to have to do where we're doing now more mailers, again, phone banking, texting. So those are some activities where our groups have had to shift in terms of the technology and the infrastructure building. I think the other part, though, is that it's more than that. It's the approach that our communities have had to take, because our communities are in crisis. I know the last two speakers spoke about how it's affecting different populations. No doubt it's the same for APIs. We have large pockets of low-income communities. We have those who are limited English. We have those who are undocumented, and they're being left out. Many times they can't afford to socially distance because they're living in SROs, or they cannot, for example, not show up to work. The work is manual labor that doesn't allow you to be remote. They're domestic workers, what have you. Yeah. And so given the hardships that our communities are facing, at the same time, what we're also seeing is that in a lot of cases, our groups are the front line for the community. And if our organizations are not operating and providing not just information around civic engagement, but just in terms of how to file for unemployment, where do you get relief? There is no other access to information. In Philadelphia, for example, the 3 Vietnamese papers shut down. So then what other source can our community have to get information if it's not the community groups that are providing in-language information? It's up to them now. So there's an opportunity, but it's also an imperative. There's not a choice that our groups have. And so what's been important is that not only have they looked at tactics, is how they've incorporated the need to meet the needs of the community while they continue to educate and empower them. Because in this time where there's a lot of fear and instability, we do not want the API community to stay invisible. We don't want them to act in fear. We want them to feel empowered. And the empowerment is from coming together. And if we can't do it physically, how else can we do it? There are other ways that can happen. I think the previous speaker spoke about young people really that one of the themes is, young people really rising above, and that we see that in, for example, in Charlotte, it's the Southeast Asian Coalition, which is largely youth-led. They're doing weekly drop-offs. They call it Operation Backup Rice, and they're doing dry pantry drop-offs to Black, Southeast Asian, and trans communities. Those are the populations that they're working closely with. And when they do that, they're also giving information about the census. They're telling people to report if they've been a victim of a hate incident. They're making sure that the communities are connected while they also meet the needs of the community. And I think in all the different ways, so how is our organizations responding is that they're looking at both, they're looking at this as a chance to ensure that when the community is in need, they're there for the community. That's about the only way you can ensure that the community will feel empowered and come back to them and register to vote and hopefully participate. Because as you can understand as well, more than ever, this is not the time for communities to be disengaged.
That's right. So I hate that I left this question to the end, because we need to have a whole discussion about how it is that we stay connected as communities who are being disproportionately impacted in a range of ways. In our last question, though, for this section, I just want to ask you, what are the practices of solidarity that we can engage in a moment where we have I don't even want to call him a president. I'm just like, not even want to do that. We have somebody in office, right, who is literally using anti-Asian racism to inflame a white nationalist base that is trying to reshape politics in this country. So what does it look like for all of our communities to be in solidarity? But in particular, what does it look like for our communities to be in solidarity against anti-Asian racism?
Yeah, and it's true that we have someone that's started sort of fanning anti-Asian sentiments, but we're also seeing political opportunism on the ground.
Yep.
Michigan, the Senate race, it's both Senate candidates are using anti-Chinese messages. So there's a calculation there that this is what's going to attract voters, and so one is obviously we need to decry that. In a lot of cases, our groups on the ground have had to create hate tracking sites because otherwise it's somehow like if there's no data, there's no proof, and it doesn't exist. And so it's been incumbent on our community groups to track that kind of activities. But obviously, tracking is not enough. This is related to advocacy. When we talk about advocacy, how do we do it differently than in the past? In other words, how do we condemn hate incidents without in any way pushing for criminalization? How do we push for community-centered solutions? How do we ensure that this is something where it's no longer about the interpersonal, but it's actually state sanctioned? And how do we ensure that we address that? So I think that API communities have learned from the past. That's what I like to think. This time around, when we look at the attacks on Chinese Americans, what Southeast Asian and other Asian American communities are saying is we are all Chinese. And that's a really powerful statement rather than separating, because, that's one of the issues around the API community is how can we be unified and how can we make a strategic unity? The other is about when they call out against anti-Blackness, when there's incidences that are isolated and that's being used as somehow this is a stereotypical narrative of what is happening, and that isn't it. It really is more state violence. State violence affects us differently, whether it's incarceration or detention, deportation, Muslim profiling, all of us are facing it. So I think when you're talking about how do we create solidarity, I think the groups on the ground know best. And they've been doing this work for a long time. And it's because they're already able to address it in such a way.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you so much. Look, I'm taking so much from what you've just talked with us about here. And honestly, what I'm taking is, I don't want to be too flippant about this, but united we stand, divided we fall, my people. It is really that kind of do or die moment. EunSook, thank you for all the work that you're doing. And let's keep going.
Thank you, Alicia. Take care.
Thank you. You too.